Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Commander's Quarters decks are built within a $25 budget that's $25 for 100 cards. And prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCGPLAYER. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. Today's commander is Sasaya Orochi Ascendant. It starts off as a 2/3 snake monk that costs 1 green. It says reveal your hand. If you have 7 or more lands in your hand, flip Sasaya Orochi Ascendant. It flips into the legendary enchantment Sasaya's Essence. It says whenever a land you control is tapped for mana, add 1 mana of that type to your mana pool for each other land you control with the same name. So although the condition of 7 lands in hand can be very tough to meet, the payoff is well worth it. Once this flips, even with just 4 forests in play, we'll have access to 16 mana. 5 will be 25, 6 will be 36, and so on and so forth. So our strategy for this deck is very straightforward. We just want to get 7 lands into our hand as quickly as possible. Again, our commander is pretty useless until it flips, so we need to make sure that we can get those lands into our hand consistently. And then how do we win with this deck? Well, we're going to create a ton of tokens or deal a lot of damage all at once. Green has a ton of great mana sinks that we can dump all of our mana into to win the game. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. So let's get started with our first tactic. Tactic number 1, Solid Soil. First up, there's Horizon Spellbomb, which we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put into our hand. On top of that, when it's put into our graveyard from the battlefield, we can pay a green to draw a card. The great thing about this is this can actually get us 2 forests in our hand if we're lucky and we draw a forest. Next up, we've got Sylvan Ranger, Gatecreeper Vine, and Pilgrim's Eye, each of which is going to get us a basic land when they come into play. And then we have 3 more creatures that do the exact same thing with Borderland Ranger, District Guide, and Civic Wayfinder. Not only do these creatures replace themselves, but they also act as really good early blockers. And finally, we can cycle Crows and Tusker for 2 and a green, and when we cycle it, we can search our library for basic land to put into our hand. Like Horizon Spellbomb, we're guaranteed to get 1 forest, and we can actually get 2 because of that draw. It's nice to get 1 land, but it's even better for us to get 2 because again, we want to get to 7 as quickly as possible. So let's go through some more ways to get more lands in tactic number 2, Gaining Ground. First up, there's Nissa's Pilgrimage, which says, search your library for up to 2 basic forest cards, reveal those cards, and put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and the rest into your hand. But if we happen to have Spell Mastery, we actually get 2 forests in our hand instead of 1. Not only can this card ramp us, but it can also get 2 forests into our hand, which is a very good deal for just 3 mana. And then we're running Gaia's Bounty, which is going to get us 2 forests into our hand. Journey of Discovery is going to do the exact same thing, but if we entwine it for 2 and a green, we can also put 2 additional lands into play. Next up, there's Wildfield Scarecrow, which we can pay 2 and sacrifice it to get 2 lands into our hand. Yavimaya Elder is very similar. It has when it dies, we can search our library for those 2 lands. And we can make that happen by paying 2 and sacrificing it to draw a card. So not only are we guaranteed those 2 lands, but we can also end up with a 3rd. Next up is our Mealery Sphere, which we can pay 2 and sacrifice it to go get 2 basic lands. And finally, there's Colony Gem, which isn't going to search for any lands, but it's still going to get some back into our hand. It has, when it enters the battlefield, return 2 lands you control to their owner's hand, and we can tap it to add 2 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool. Now, getting 2 lands into your hand is great, but we want the possibility of even more. So let's go on to tactic number 3, Excellent Earth. First up, there's Seek the Horizon, which is going to let us search our library for up to 3 basic lands and put them into our hand. And then there's Mulch, which says, reveal the top 4 cards of your library, put all land cards revealed this way into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. So for just 2 mana, we can end up getting 4 lands into our hand. Now there's also the possibility of whiffing and getting 0, but usually we're going to get around 2. Next up, there's Sprouting Vines, which is pretty much guaranteed to get us 2 or more. It says, search your library for a basic land card, reveal that card, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. But what makes this card good is that it's an instant that has Storm. So usually we're going to play this on one of our opponent's turns and hope that they cast more than 1 spell in that turn. The more spells that are cast in that turn, the more lands that we get. And then we're running Rites of Spring, which can pretty much flip our commander on its own. With it, we can discard any number of cards from our hand to go get that many basic lands. And finally, we're going to be running some repeatable effects with Journeyer's Kite, Thematic Compass, and Realm Seeker. Both Journeyer's Kite and Thematic Compass allow us to pay 3 and tap them to search our library for basic land. On top of that, Thematic Compass has, at the beginning of your end step, if you control 7 or more lands, transform Thematic Compass. It transforms into Spires of Araska, which we can use it to tap for a colorless, or we can tap it to untap target attacking creature an opponent controls and remove it from combat. This is a fantastic additional effect on a card that we already would have been running. And finally, there's Realm Seekers, which enters the battlefield with X+1/+1 counters on it, where X is the total number of cards in all players' hands. And then we can pay 2 and a green to remove a +1/+1 counter from it to search our library for a land card, reveal it, put into our hand, then shuffle our library. This card can actually be really big when we cast it, and it can actually help us get those lands if we need them. But searching for lands isn't the only way that we can get them into our hand. We can also just draw them. So let's go through some spells that help us with that in tactic number 4, Dirt and Draw. First up, there's Harmonize, which is a great draw spell. It's going to draw us 3 cards for 4 mana. And then we're running Dryad Undyed Greenseeker, which has tap, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. Nearly half of our deck is land, so it's got a decent shot every single time we tap it. And then we can tap Magus of the Library to draw a card, but we can only play this ability if we have exactly 7 cards in hand. With the amount of lands that we search for and get into our hand, we have no problem at getting to 7 cards. Next up, we're going to be running Abundance, which actually isn't card draw, but it is card selection. Essentially, whenever we would draw a card, we can choose to draw either a land or a non-land card. So this card comes in huge in 2 ways. It can help us get up to 7 lands so that we can flip our commander, and then after we flip our commander, it makes sure that we don't draw any dead lands. And then there's Rites of Flourishing, which also has a dual purpose in this deck. It essentially allows everyone to draw an additional card and play an additional land each turn. Now early on, we're not going to be playing those additional lands because we usually need those lands in our hand to flip our commander. But those extra draws definitely come in handy, and later on, we're definitely going to want to play additional lands. Next up, we've got some repeatable draw effects with Endless Atlas, Seer Sundial, and Tower of Fortunes. As long as we have 3 forests in play, we can pay 2 and tap Endless Atlas to draw a card. And then with Seer Sundial, whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we can pay 2 to draw a card. Tower of Fortunes is definitely a late game activation. We can pay 8 to tap it to draw 4 cards. And later on in the game, once we flip our commander, 8 mana is nothing to this deck. And then we've got some semi-wheel effects with Credit Voucher and Nantuko Cultivator. We can pay 2 and tap and sacrifice Credit Voucher to shuffle any number of cards from our hand into our library, then draw that many cards. So this can come in handy in 2 ways. Early on, we can use this to ditch any non-land cards in our hand to try to get to 7 lands. But where this is really effective is after we get to those 7 lands, we can discard those cards to draw into some non-lands. Nantuko Cultivator basically does that as well, because when it comes into play, we can discard any number of land cards from our hand, and then we put that many +1/+1 counters on it, and we draw that many cards. Flipping our commander is great, but if we don't have anything to cast with it, all that mana goes to waste. And finally, we're running Book of Wrath, which has 2, pay 2 life, draw a card. This is a fantastic repeatable effect that can help us go get our game-winning cards. But we can't just focus solely on our game plan, we also have to focus on disrupting our opponents. Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 5, A Natural Life. First up, there's Broken Bond, which says destroy target artifact or enchantment. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. That extra utility is great, especially after our commander flips. Every single land that we add greatly increases the amount of mana that we can produce. And then there's Reclamation Sage, which says when it enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. This is a great early blocker that provides some fantastic utility. So not only are we going to be disrupting our opponents, but our opponents are going to try to disrupt us. Let's go through some ways to deal with that in tactic number 6, Stay With Me. First up, there's Wildest Dreams, which lets us return X target cards from our graveyard to our hand. This card can be good early in the game if we have a crucial card that we need to get back. But this is also a fantastic late game play because we can pump a ton of mana into it to get all the cards that we need back. If we're set up well enough, this can help us protect our position on top, get our win conditions back, and win the game. But an even better form of protection comes from our Golden Pig. Our Golden Pig is going to be the number 1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Soul of New Phyrexia. Soul of New Phyrexia is a 6/6 avatar with trample that costs 6. It has pay 5, permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn. And pay 5, exile Soul of New Phyrexia from your graveyard, permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn. This is a fantastic repeatable way to protect all of our permanents. Once our commander flips, we pretty much have access to as much mana as we need to protect it and everything else. There are ways to get around indestructible such as exiling or bouncing, but usually this does the job. Being able to pretty much ensure that our commander is going to stay on the board and flipped is huge for this deck. It keeps us way ahead of our opponents and in a very dominant position. And that's what makes Soul of New Phyrexia the Golden Pig of the deck. So once our commander is flipped and we can produce a ton of mana, how do we use it to dominate our opponents? Let's talk about some ways to utilize it in tactic number 7, Search for Tomorrow. First up, there's Genesis Hydra, which says when you cast it, reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put a non-land permanent card with converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield. Then shuffle the rest into your library, and Genesis Hydra enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. So we can put a ton of mana into this, not only to get a giant beater, but also to get another creature with it. We've got some creatures in this deck that have some good mana sync abilities, and this can help us go get them. And then we've got Uncage the Menagerie, which tutors in a different way. It says search your library for up to X creature cards with different names that each have a converted mana cost X, reveal them, and put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. So essentially this card allows us to get multiple creatures with the same converted mana cost and put them directly into our hand. We've got plenty of creatures in this deck that we can sink a lot of mana into when we cast them. So in terms of tutoring, we probably prefer this effect over Genesis Hydra. But what are some of those creatures that we're going to be tutoring for? Let's go through them now in tactic number 8, Creature Creators. First up, there's Ant Queen that can create 1/1 green insect creature tokens for just 1 and a green. Now a 1/1 might not seem like much, but this can get out of hand quickly with this stack. For example, if we have just 6 forests in play, we can generate 36 mana. So with all that mana, we can create 18 insects each turn. With that amount of token generation, it's going to be easy for us to overwhelm our opponents. And then there's Hydra Broodmaster, which can create some giant tokens. It has Monstrosity X for XX and a green. And when it becomes monstrous, put XXX green Hydra creature tokens onto the battlefield. So let's go through that same scenario where we have 36 mana. With that amount of mana, we can make X equal to 17. So we would get 17, 17, 17 green Hydras. That's a total of 289 power, and these Hydras can easily wipe out our opponents if they stay on the board. And finally, we've got 2 creatures that we want to dump our mana into when we cast them. Wolfbriar Elemental has a multi-kicker for green, and it says when it enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 green wolf creature token for each time it was kicked. And then Vertaloth the Ancient has a kicker for X, and it says when it enters the battlefield, if if it was kicked, put X 1/1 green sapling creature tokens onto the battlefield. But as long as Vertilos is on the battlefield, those saplings are going to be 2/2s because it gives all saplings +1/+1. Both of these are fantastic mana sinks that can create an absurd amount of tokens that can easily overwhelm our opponents. But there are other ways for us to create tokens outside of creatures. Let's go through those ways now in tactic number 9, token time. First up, there's Worm Calling, which says put an XX green worm creature token into play. Now this spell would be pretty mediocre, but it has a buyback cost for 2 and a green. So we can just keep buying this back and casting it again and again and again. It's a very flexible card that allows us to create creatures for the exact size that we need. And then there's Gelatinous Genesis, which is less flexible but can be much more impactful. This is pretty much a sorcery version of Hydra Broodmaster's ability. But instead of creating Hydras, it's going to create oozes. Next up is Orochi Hatchery, which is a fantastic repeatable way to create tokens. It costs XX and it enters the battlefield with X charge counters on it. We can pay 5 and tap it to put a 1/1 green snake creature token onto the battlefield for each charge counter on it. So we can cast this for a ton of mana, and then every single turn we can just pay 5 and tap it to put a ton of snakes into play. And finally, we're running Centaur Glade, which allows us to pay 2 green to put a 3/3 green Centaur creature token into play. This is another great mana sink for us that sticks around, and it's hard for our opponents to deal with. But there are other ways to win outside of creating tokens. So let's go through them in our final tactic. Tactic number 10, damage goods. First up, there's Pelucranos World Eater, which has Monstrosity X for XX and a green. When it becomes monstrous, it deals X damage divided as we choose among any number of target creatures our opponents control. Each of those creatures deals damage equal to its power to it. Depending on the board state and with enough mana, we can essentially make Pelucranos into a giant beater that destroys every other creature. And then we're running Ursipine, which can make any creature into a big beater. It has pay a green, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So not only can it turn itself into a game-winning creature, but it can also turn any of our other creatures into them too. On top of that, in the right situation, we can even pump an opponent's creature. If our opponent swings at another with an evasive creature, we can just actually pump that creature to kill them. And finally, there's Hurricane and Squall Line, both of which pretty much do the exact same thing. They deal X damage to each creature with flying and each player. The only difference between the two is that Squall Line costs 1 more and is an instant. So if we have the highest life total and have enough mana, we can kill all of our opponents at once. This deck can be a lot of fun and is very explosive the second our commander flips. But now that we've gone through the cards that help us win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. First off, we're going to be running Tranquil Thicket, which enters the battlefield tapped, taps for a green, and can cycle for a green. And then there's Blasted Landscape, which can tap for a colorless, and we can cycle it for 2. Slippery Karst can also cycle for 2, but it enters the battlefield tapped, it can tap for a green. Desert of the Indomitable is the exact same, but its cycling is for 1 and a green. And finally, we're going to be running 44 basic lands, each will be a forest. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Sasaya EDHREC deck is going to set you back $109.03. Let's see if we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at $24.93. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades that you can add into the deck and what I would take out for those cards too. Just a quick disclaimer before we get into this, these reasonable upgrades are going to be completely based off of my own perspective. When you're making choices on how to adjust your deck, you're taking your own playstyle and meta into account. So make sure that you factor that in when it comes to making your own decisions on what to swap in and what to swap out. Now that we're on the same page, let's go through how I personally would upgrade the deck. First, let's add in Nissa Vastwood Seer, which comes in at $7.65. It's a 2/2 Elf Scout that costs 2 and a green. It says when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. And whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, exile Nissa, then return her to the battlefield transform under her owner's control. She transforms into the Planeswalker Nissa Sage Animist. She starts off at 3 loyalty, and she has +1, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield, otherwise put it into your hand. Her -2 puts a legendary 4/4 green elemental creature token onto the battlefield. And her -7 says untap up to 6 target lands, they become 6/6 elemental creatures, they're still lands. To put this in, we're going to be taking out District Guide. Essentially, these start off as the exact same card, but Nissa has a lot more potential. Especially later on in the game, her +1 can come in huge. So this is a pretty easy swap for us. And then let's upgrade this deck by adding in Beast Within, which comes in at $1.40. It's an instant that costs 2 and a green, and it says destroy target permanent, its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature token. To put this in, let's take out Reclamation Sage. Beast Within is a fantastic piece of removal. It can take out pretty much any threat, and that 3/3 green beast token that it leaves behind isn't a big deal. It's just a lot more flexible than Reclamation Sage, which can only take out artifacts or enchantments. Next up, let's add in Praetor's Council, which comes in at $3.28. It's a sorcery that costs 5 and 3 green, and it says return all cards from your graveyard to your hand, exile Praetor's Council, you have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. To put this in, let's take out Wildest Dreams. While we can sink a lot of mana into Wildest Dreams to get a lot of cards back, it's better for us to just put 8 mana in to get every single card back. And having no maximum hand size is a nice addition. And then let's add in Kamal Fist of Krosa, which comes in at $7.46. It's a 4/3 human druid that costs 4 green. It has pay green, target land becomes a 1/1 creature until end of turn, it's still a land. And pay 2 and 3 green, creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. To put Kamal in, let's take out Realm Seekers. Kamal is a fantastic mana sink for us that can not only win us the game, but can also protect our board. If an opponent ever tries to cast a board wipe, we can just turn everyone else's lands into creatures. Although Realm Seekers can be a big beater for us, it can just be a bit too slow. Its ability is great, but if we haven't flipped our commander by the time we get it out, we're probably in big trouble. Next up, let's add in Genesis Wave, which comes in at $3.94. It's a sorcery that costs X and 3 green, and it says reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put any number of permanent cards with converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield. Then put all cards revealed this way that weren't put onto the battlefield into your graveyard. To put this in, we're going to be taking out Genesis Hydra. Genesis Wave is just a much better version of the Hydra. Instead of just getting us one permanent, it gets us every single one, including lands. After casting this, we'll have an insane amount of mana to put into whatever mana sink that we get. Finally, let's upgrade this deck with Court of Calling, which comes in at $9.34. It's an instant that costs X and 3 green, and it has Convoke. It says search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost of X or less and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. To put this in, let's take out Hurricane. Court of Calling allows us to at instant speed go get any of our mana sink creatures. Hurricane can be a great finisher, but it also depends on us having more life than our opponents. So generally, Court of Calling is going to be more dependable. And with that, this show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you guys think about this episode, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying a deck or just individual cards, make sure to use our link in the description. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCGPLAYER, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel, then check out some of our other episodes on budget deck techs, break the bank episodes, commander topics, and creators quarters episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.